my pleasure to introduce Geoff Huston. It's the 10th or 11th time I've introduced you by now. Geoff is no stranger to the nanonaut community, having been on stage over 20 times. Geoff is most notable for his pivotal role in bringing the internet to Australia in the 1990s. Geoff's current role at APNIC enables him to focus his research on topics such as address distribution policy, internet infrastructure, IP technologies, and more. Today, Geoff is speaking to us about measuring Starlink protocol performance. So, yeah, did I do it right this time?
Yeah, you got it right.
Oh, good. Welcome, Geoff.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, look, it's a pleasure to actually be here in person, and I am sorry about last October. Me and my pedal bicycle had a difference of opinion, and I lost. But I was watching. And there was a really quite an interesting talk from Thousand Eyes about Starlink performance. And they did active measurement. And one of the results I found was actually quite intriguing. It's in really small font, but they reported that when they used the BBR protocol, it ran up to 18 times faster than a conventional TCP running cubic. 18 times? I'm like, if you are able to say, well, all I need to do is change the congestion control protocol and I'll take all the bandwidth from all of you people, I'm there, give me bandwidth. And it's really a question about what's so special about the combination of BBR and Starlink that makes it absolutely sing when you use them together. What's going on inside Starlink that makes BBR so cute? Now, a little bit of physics to start with. I don't know how familiar most of you are with this stuff. It's taken me a little bit of time to get there. But LEO satellites are relatively new in our world. They're low. Geostationary is around 38,000 kilometres away. These things tuck in under 2,000 kilometres in height. And in the case of Starlink, they're around about 500 kilometres up there. Now, they avoid the Earth's atmosphere. And that's a good thing, because if you start grazing the atmosphere, you get hot, you burn up, and bad things happen. So you need to get above that. But of course, the problem is solar radiation. The sun is not exactly a nice thing. It emits a huge amount of high-energy particles. And what protects us, oddly enough, is a spinning iron core. Why does Mars not have an atmosphere? The core stopped spinning. Oops, the solar radiation blew all the atmosphere away. Oops, the water vaporized. Oops, cold, dead planet. Remember, Elon, cold and dead, if you're watching. The Earth, however, still has a spinning iron core, thank God. That means we actually have a Van Allen belt that protects low satellites below 2,000 kilometres against solar radiation. So these satellites don't need lead BVDs. They don't need to be coated against radiation. You can put almost any electronics up there and it will probably work because they're not being bombarded. So at around 550 kilometres, they're tucked in close. They're between 3 and a bit to 4 milliseconds to get there and back. So they're fast. There's nothing in the way. No buildings, no trees, no shadows. So almost anything can reach it. You don't need a huge amount of equipment in a massive Earth station. Even handhelds can have a fractured conversation with them. And if you've got a decent antenna, say, a metre by a metre, you can get pretty high speeds. Now, they're low. They're very low. They don't see much of the Earth. So you need a lot of them, because each of them is zooming overhead, to cover you in a particular stationary position. A large number for a continuous service. So you actually need a way to get a lot of them up there cheaply. What made Starlink so interesting was actually the reusable rocket, because he managed to slash the launch price per kilo by a factor of 3 against his competitors. That's why he's able to do this. The architecture, well, it's standard stuff in so many ways, but there is one thing that's different. In this constellation, they're not just mirrors in the sky, they've got lasers, space lasers. And they're actually pointing at the one ahead and the one behind. Now, because it's not a mirror in the sky, I don't need to dot the Earth with earth stations. If there's nothing close by, it can send the signal onto the next Starlink device, the next spacecraft, to the next and down. The service in Western Mongolia beams down to the Earth in Japan. Now that satellite can't see both points, it's too close. So what it does is it goes up, goes across, and comes down in both directions. So the combination is what gives this particular constellation phenomenal coverage. But that doesn't mean life is easy. When you're down low, to keep in orbit, you've got to move fast, 27,000 kilometres an hour. That means that these things go from horizon to horizon in 5 minutes. This is not take a big dish and look upwards. You'd burn out the bearings, because it's take a big dish and swing it like crazy, because to track any particular satellite, you've really got to move pretty constantly. That's an animation of some point, but it doesn't really matter if it doesn't work. The thing is, if you look up any point on the Earth's surface, you'll probably see around about 30 to 50 visible satellites. You don't look horizon to horizon, you angle it up a bit, 25 degrees in elevation. And each of them goes across that visible aperture in about 3 minutes. So how does Starlink actually work? You don't track a satellite, not for that long. You track it for just 11 degrees. And so you swing across and track a new satellite precisely every 15 seconds. The entire constellation as an Earth station at 2 seconds past the minute, 17, 32, and 47 seconds past the minute, and it's really accurate, you get assigned the new spacecraft, and you're constantly just moving from satellite to satellite every 15 seconds. In protocol terms, think of this as a low-frequency noise component. At a frequency of every 15 seconds, you've got a beat. You've got a change in the characteristics of the channel. That's important. Starlink itself doesn't train its beam on you. There are too many of you and not enough Starlink. So it just aims beams downwards. Has 2 gigahertz of analog spectrum. It splits it into 8 channels, each of 250 meg, 3 downs, 1 up, which is how you get it. So what's going on though, is that each spacecraft is sweeping the Earth a bit like a spotlight. Now imagine you're on the Earth looking up. It's kind of dark, then you're right in the spotlight, and then it's kind of dark again. That means that the signal to noise ratio is constantly changing. That what you actually see, one of these is a laser pointer, is a constantly altering signal to noise. Because what you're seeing on the fringe is a lousy signal. When the beam is directly aimed at you and it at you, really strong signal, and then a lousy signal again. So this is not fibre, it's not copper, and it's not even a geostationary. Everything is moving at a phenomenal speed. And what does that mean? Well, if you actually looked at a dishy, and a lot of you have, you get these reports of downlink throughput, uplink throughput, and ping time. Now, if you constantly frob at your dishy, because, why not, and you start measuring those numbers, you get something that you cannot replicate on Earth. Because every single time you ask, you get a different number. A completely different number. As you see, there is a massive noise component. On the left is the downlink and uplink, and it reports anything from 40 megabits per second up to 400, because what it's not reporting is the actual capacity that you might be able to get. It's reporting the channel capacity based on the signal encoding that it's doing for that frame. Because it's constantly changing its signal encoding because the signal to noise ratio is constantly changing. You only get this in satellites. The latency is constantly changing because every time you try and change your signal encoding, you need to take a breath to re-establish a new coding pattern. So while it takes 7 milliseconds or so to get a signal up and down electrically, if you count the encoding beat, it takes longer. So that's why the service is weird. It's got this really high frequency component, which is incredibly unstable, and a 15-second component, which completely changes the world. Let's look at this again at a longer time frame. This is across 6 minutes, and I'm looking at latency about 30 times a second. And you notice something really weird going on. Every 15 seconds, the minimum latency changes. Each time you get assigned to a new spacecraft, you get assigned a different base latency. Because whatever's going on there, there's a subtly different encoding going on. You can actually see it being scheduled. The other thing is when I look at loss, I only ever get loss on a scheduling change. And I normally only get single packet loss. This isn't tail drop. If it was tail drop, TCP would go, look, I know what's going on. This is not a congestion drop, it's a scheduling drop. So I've got these two components, high speed, high frequency, low frequency. And somehow I have to adapt to it. This is what happens in handover. All of a sudden the latency shoots right up to 80 to 90 milliseconds, just at the point that I switch over to a new spacecraft. And at that point I get loss. And then it stabilizes again, if you can call that stable, into a new generation of latency on the next spacecraft. So somehow you've got to make TCP work. Somehow you've got to take TCP, optimized originally for copper and then for fiber, against an incredibly noisy signal. TCP thinks there's a ceiling above me of maximal capacity, and it's fixed across multiple RTTs, multiple round trip times. And all I have to do is ramp up and touch against that upper bound. I know when I'm touching against that upper bound because the queues fill up, I get packet drop, congestion loss, back off a bit. So TCP is all about testing a fixed upper bound. What does Starlink have? Certainly doesn't have a fixed upper bound. It's incredibly noisy. So TCP gets adrift. And what exactly happens there is that packet loss is not a signal of congestion, I'm going too fast. Packet loss is just, well, it's 15 seconds since the last time, I'm changing spacecraft, you're going to get a bit of latency and loss. So all of a sudden, the mechanisms that we use don't work very well. SAC is probably useful, but that's about it. So, the other thing you also notice is that physically, it should only take about 7 milliseconds. But in protocol terms, it's taking around 20. Why? Who's got the other 13 milliseconds? I want them back. They're mine. Well, you can't. Because Starlink, and I don't work for them and they don't tell me what they do, so, it's a secret. But my guess is that they're using IEEE 802.11ac, borrowed, I think, from 4G or 5G, someone out there knows. And it does dynamic channel control. The signal modulation, the number of points in Fourier space that you're encoding into, changes with every frame. Because if you really want performance in a varying signal to noise, you don't just pick the worst possible case and latch onto it. That's abysmal. You try and optimize throughout that varying signal to noise. So when you're getting really good signal, pack in a whole lot of data. Use a really dense signal encoding. When you start getting to the fringes of the beam, do in less. But don't do this minute by minute. Do this frame by frame. 750 frames per second, you're doing a lot of movement around channel encoding. There's a continuous shift in the way you encode the signal, and that adds milliseconds into the RTT time. That's that extra 13 milliseconds. It's all about doing that dynamic signal encoding. So, I've got two components, high frequency, low frequency. And TCP is really struggling with those two components. ACK pacing doesn't really help you because there's no constant throbbing of the underlying circuit because it's not a fixed circuit. It's a shifting sand. So I've got these 750 frames per second, 302 intervals. Each frame contains its own modulation. So what's going on here is that this is unique. You've got a completely different situation with very high speeds involved and very quick changes. And you also got, of course, it's not my satellite, it's not my bearer, it's our bearer. I've got to share with all you other bastards out there, right? It's a common signal. So atop all of this is the more people that buy Starlink close to me, the more I've got a competition going on for bandwidth. So there's common contention as well. So that's what I've said so far. You've got high frequency and low frequency noise components, you've got channel contention, adaptive rate control, and you've got regular periodic non-congestion packet loss. Now, if I use speed test, it says, nah, this is easy. It just works. And that's a graph across a year or so. And it says Starlink is slowly getting better as the number of spacecraft are increasing. They are actually improving their act. And speed test says I should be getting around about between 150 and 200 megabits per second out of a Starlink connection. Yay. But I'm dealing with TCP. And TCP doesn't know it's going over Starlink. It's just some server in some rack somewhere, and I'm at the other end of a Starlink connection. So you get the typical Reno behavior, that's in red, inflate the congestion window, find congestion, drop packet dross, redo it again. Or you get cubic, which is what most folk use these days, which is that typical blue pattern. You sort of try and oscillate around optimal, push it a bit harder, get lost, readjust. Or you get BBR, which is completely different. It's not a loss-sensitive protocol. It's a very different kind of protocol. So let's look at iPerf. I'm using cubic. I'm running it for 40 seconds across Starlink. Now I've done in red what actually is happening here. And what you actually see is there are a number of points where that single packet loss causes cubic to go eek, drop its congestion window and start up again. So it never gets more than about 50 megabits a second because the packet loss is a confusing signal. The other part about cubic is that it's constantly sampling the available rate. It's sensitive to high frequency noise. And so it never has enough room to go fast because its ramp increases are too slow. Starlink defeats it. So that's why you get about 30 to 40 megabits per second out of a conventional TCP running across Starlink because it's not adapted to Starlink, right? BBR. Now, BBR is very, very different. I don't know how much of you know about BBR, but basically the way it works is once it gets steady state, for 6 round trip times, it just shuts its eyes and doesn't change anything. It sends at a constant rate. Whatever it thinks is the link capacity is what it's going to do for 6 round trip times. If there's any high frequency noise component, BBR says, I don't care. I've got my eyes shut and I'm running at a constant rate. That's actually really fortunate because Starlink does use deep buffers. Take that, buffer bloat people. Why? Because of the high frequency noise component. Because it's got this really high frequency jitter, you absorb that jitter inside the buffers in Dishy and at the other end. So for that, BBR is perfect because BBR is kind of going, look, whatever, I just don't care about high frequency delay. That's not part of my language. On the 7th round trip time, it amplifies its sending rate by 25%. That's not a touch, that's a whoomph. It's kind of, wow, take that network, because that's a big jump. And then the next round trip time, it drops it by 25% to kind of absorb what happened. And if the delay didn't change, it goes, fine, I'll just keep on going at this rate. If there was some change when it inflated, it'll adjust up or down. It adapts to low frequency changes in the network. What does Starlink have? Every 15 seconds there's a change in the network, low frequency. So you see on this graph across that same kind of 40-second interval, when 15 seconds comes and you get reassigned, and don't forget, the channel capacity is not what TCP is trying to optimize against, it's delay times bandwidth, delay. So when you get a change in delay, you need a change in TCP. BBR changes. And the BBR rate, and let that scale, is now running between 300 and 400 megabits per second. It jumps up and adapts almost immediately and runs it at that rate for the next 15 seconds. When you get another change, it does another adaptation. So oddly enough, BBR and Starlink work well because BBR is not high frequency sensitive. It's a low frequency protocol. So why does it work well? Because Starlink do a number of things which are really unusual in almost everywhere else that you look. Very high frequency jitter. Every frame is different. Micro loss at about 1.4%. A regular as clockwork, lost a packet, exactly every 15 seconds. And you've got a more typical, you're competing with other users, damn it. And those are the three issues that really affect the way Starlink actually works. So all of these loss-based algorithms, which I would characterize as being insanely polite, don't work. Because they're insanely polite, not to other users, but to the characteristics of the service itself. Bandwidth is being left on the table because it just can't adapt, because every time it gets a loss, every time it sort of does a sensor at the time when the high frequency signal is down, it just goes, I better go slower. So for that respect, loss-based algorithms work really well for short transactions. DNS over Starlink, brilliant. Even things like Zoom and so on will work. But if you really want to squeeze the last drop of juice out of Starlink, have the other end run BBR at you. Because as soon as you do that, what you actually find is you extract all the available bandwidth that's available to you, modulo congestion and all those other users. And in fact, even as we've found in Earth-based systems, BBR in competition with cubic is not a competition. It really, really isn't. BBR is an insanely greedy protocol. So as long as none of you run it, and I run it, we're fine. Other times, not so good. So, what could you do even if you weren't running BBR? Fair queuing always works. Don't send bursts. Pace your packets. Avoid bursting and tail drop, because that just makes it worse. Selective acknowledgement should always be used, and more so in Starlink. Those single packet drops, SAC should be able to recover it without collapsing the congestion window. If you're not using selective acknowledgement, you're just killing yourself. What I haven't done so far, and I'm really interested in trying this, is to see the latest work with L4S. And I know Apple are very keen on it at this point, when you're doing packet marking pre-congestion. Because there is a certain amount of congestion. They do have deep buffers, but there's a certain amount of congestion going on. ECN should be able to get you through that without actually collapsing your sending window. So my suspicion is ECN would actually be really helpful, even if you weren't running BBR. So my experience after 2 years of this, it does work really, really well. Really well. Even for Zoom and video conferencing and so on, most of the time you can't even tell you're on Starlink. It can sustain 40 to 50 megabits per second of delivery no matter what. That just seems to be a given. Off-peak, when you're not contending against your local neighbour, faster still. And even without BBR, you can get TCP cubic up to around 200, 300 megabits per second at about 2 in the morning. You're 2 in the morning, because you're only competing in a local cell. So if you're out in the middle of nowhere, Starlink works. Even in cities without a whole lot of other people, Starlink works. It's not the best for trunking, and it's only very, very recently, in fact I was told this morning that they're doing wholesale services in Nauru, that Starlink is actually being used beyond direct retail to end users. I'm not sure how well that actually works, but maybe Nauru is different. But as an end single user retail point, it's brilliant. It's really good, and it's incredibly high speed and gets over a whole bunch of problems that we're all having with the last mile infrastructure, both in rural and remote, and oddly even in cities where it's just nonsense. So it's a fascinatingly new way of thinking about networking. Will it enhance a push to BBR? Interesting. BBR has had a very mixed reception from this industry. Some regard it as too aggressive. Others regard it, like me, as, oh my God, I've been waiting for this for years. It's fantastic. So I'm in the camp that says, let's just do it, because it works. He wants to make it faster. There is an increase in the next generation of satellites to higher transmitter power. Fascinating. Narrower beams, because he's going to put up more spacecraft, up to 30,000. Fascinating. The orbital altitude is coming down, down as low as 340 kilometres. If you go much lower, during high solar activity, the Earth's atmosphere inflates and things get a bit hot. And so there's kind of a lower level that kind of goes, if you want lifetime out of these things, pushing it much lower than that tends to start grazing the atmosphere during solar events, and that's probably not a good idea. Interestingly, I'm not sure what he's going to do, but he wants to drop the minimum elevation to 20 degrees. Now, 25 means with phased array steering, doesn't really matter where the antenna's sort of positioned. It should be okay. But that low in the sky, I'm not sure if you're getting back to steerable dishes or not, but he wants to drop the minimum elevation to 20 degrees. And of course, he wants to invade more bandwidth. He's only got the satellite spectrum he can use, but he wants to use bits out of Ka, V, and E bands to try and squeeze every last drop of bandwidth. How do I know this? Because they told the FCC last October. So those are their plans as far as we can tell. So I have about 5 minutes left. That should be enough for questions, in which case I will happily try and answer them. Or if there's someone from Starlink here, they can answer them for me, because I'm just guessing. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Geoff. That was amazingly informative. Anybody in person? Matt Petak has one. Matt Petak, unaffiliated. Geoff, so BBR works well for Starlink in a single stream. What about if everybody's running BBR with Starlink? Is the advantage lost when deep buffers are exhausted? I think you answered that already.
What actually happens with BBR is that when you put multiple BBR sessions together, they don't play nicely with each other, they play almost randomly. Don't forget they adapt at very low frequency. So you actually find it throbs more than fair shares. So one party out of 20 might get more than the others for a particular sequence of round trip times, 6 round trip times, and then it will shift the other way. BBR is kind of a special protocol, and it's very, very early days in mass deployment. But quite frankly, I think it's the best thing that's ever happened to networking since the early days of TCP in the late 80s. So, you know, I'm still optimistic about it. I'm not throwing rocks at it myself.
Oh, good. I thought you were going to say some sliced bread in 1928. The back microphone, please.
Okay. Hi, Chris Woodfield, unaffiliated. I don't believe iPerf3 supports this yet, but I'm wondering if you've done any measurements using HTTP3 or QUIC.
I did measurements on QUIC, and oddly enough, it doesn't matter whether you're using a TCP wrapper or a UDP wrapper. What really, really matters is the congestion control algorithm inside. So the QUIC I was using, QPerf, happened to have cubic, and it behaved like cubic. It was just cubic. Oddly enough, I've yet to find out there, and my Git skills are questionable, a QUIC running BBR. And if anyone has one, I'd happily, get the hint, because BBR and QUIC should run as well as BBR over TCP or BBR over anything else. It's a congestion control that matters, not the transport wrapper.
Thank you.
Thank you. Quick roll here. Matt says thank you. Going once, going twice, going thrice. Geoff, thank you once again. Look forward to seeing you in Denver.
Thank you very much. Thank you.